We're now at Daf Chav Beis, Omid Beis. Yotzu Mekir, Sheyesh Lehem Shem Levi. We thought that the Brisa was telling us that you can use the water of the Kiyar for the purpose of washing the limbs and the flesh of a carbanola. But that's not so, because the Mei Kiyar have a descriptive title. It's not Mayan. The Torah wants the rechitza of the Ivarim of a carbanola to be done, to be implemented in Mayan, not in something that has a Shem Levad. Now, there's a machlokas here in Rishon of exactly what the Shem Levi is, but we'll suffice it by saying it's Meikir. Ela lav de re'uyim lemeikir. In other words, we thought before that we're really talking about the water from the kiyar. Well, that can't be used for rechitzas evare ha'olah, but rather re'uyim lemeikir. In other words, it's water that would qualify for a meikir to set up kiddush yadayim raglayim. Alma mayim chayim ninu. It's flowing water. So the Gemara answers, you know what? In order to defend Reish Lakish, we're going to tell you it's a Tanoi. It's actually a Machlokas Tanoi. The Omer Rabbi Yochanan transmitted this Machlokas Tanoim. Meikir, what is Meikir? Rabbi Shmuel Omer Mei Mayon Haim. It's flowing water coming from a spring. And Chacham Omer, no, Shar Mei Mosen. Any water is fine. Doesn't have to be Maim Chaim. And it's okay for Meikir. So the brisa that we had, that was the first brisa I think we had, that the kiyar has to be filled with living water, with mayim chayim. That's not a kasha Reish Lakish, because Reish Lakish holds like the chachamim against Rabbi Shmuel, and they validate any water for the kiyar. Only Rabbi Shmuel limits it by adding the condition, the requirement of mayim chayim. Okay, that ends a long discussion for about 3 blot on the kiyar and the kiddush yadayim raglayim. Now we go on. The Mishnah at the beginning of this chapter lists amongst those kohanim that are excluded from the avoda an orel. He's uncircumcised. Minolan, how do we know that an orel is excluded from avodas hakarbon? Omer Rav Chizda, Dover zeh mitoras Moshe Lola Madnu. This is a unique kind of halacha that's derived not from the Torah itself, but from Yechezkel. Yechezkel has an entire chapter dedicated to the avodas hakohanim. And what does Yechezkel teach us in the 44th chapter of Yechezkel? If you want to take on learning Yechezkel, you have all my blessings. You need a lot of blessings. Anyway, so it says over there, a lot of, we have a full-fledged haftorah, I think, for Parshas Emor from Yechezkel, and we don't really understand what's going on there because it's against the halacha. But anyway, you hear the Gemara is waving the flag of Yechezkel. And what does it say over there? Kol ben nechar orel lev v'erel basar lo yavo el mikdashi. And there's another word here, l'sharseni. Let's just see if he has the word l'sharseni here. No, he doesn't have the word l'sharseni. Okay. Anyway, so we have here RL, and this disqualifies an RL from entering into the Migdash and certainly from doing the Avodah. How do we know? We've had this over and over again, that even if this Kohen was enjoined from doing the Avodah, but if he went ahead, pushed himself in and did the Avodah is psula. How do we know that? Tichsiv, and in the same pasuk it says, Be'aviachem b'nei nechar arle lev, v'arle basa, lios b'mikdashi, lechalo es basi. So the word lechalo here teaches you that it disqualifies the avod. Tan Rabbana, we learned to the Brisa, ben nechar. Now, in this pasuk that we quoted from Yechezkel, it not only mentions an orel, it also mentions a ben nechar. Yachol ben nechar mam. Should I take it literally? We're talking about a non-Jew, which would be very odd that, I need Yechezkel to go out of his way to teach me that a non-Jew does not qualify to do the avoda, and his avoda is mechulelas. I mean, what was the havmid otherwise? Talmud Lomar, but if you read the pasuk carefully, it says ben nechar orel erel leiv. So what is the Gemara meaning by what's the Gemara pushing here from erel leiv? We have two categories of psulim. You could have a Kohen as posel because his yuchsin are posel. His genealogy is disqualified. Or you can have a Kohen who's disqualified because of his guf. He's tameh, or he's an orel. Now, the phrase erel lev, on the other hand, it can't mean something referring to the actual physical heart, but it rather refers to his, shall we say, his spiritual makeup. In Keimatalano ben Nechar, shenisnaku masav li aviv shabashamayim. That's what erel lev is. I'm not sure if it means he engages in idol worship or he just rejects the Torah. Maybe he has no belief in God. He's an atheist. But now that you've told me that the pasuk is referring to erel lev, is ein li ela erel lev erel basam, how do you know that even if he hasn't circumcised himself, which means that physically he's an orel, how do you know he's excluded from the avoda? Talmud loma ve'erel basar utzrichi. So I need both the physical and the spiritual disqualifications, and I need both. If the Torah was only referring to someone whose guf is orel, in a state of orla, meaning he doesn't have circumcision, is mishum devois. There's some sort of repulsive dimension to the body of the Kohen who's not circumcised. Aval erel leiv de lo mois. Okay, he's he might be an idol worshiper, but his body is not. He's gemalt. Maybe he's not disqualified. Obviously, if his thoughts are focused on serving idols, then we don't want him to do the avoda for Hashem. But the case of someone who's not circumcised, like for example, we have the case of what I call hemophiliac, where two children never died from Mila. So the third child is not going to have Mila, but he has all the faith and the loyalty to the Torah that you could imagine is therefore Malot Tameh. Now we have the case of a Tameh who, if he's enjoined from doing the avodah, if he goes ahead and does the avodah, he's possible. Now, with regard to Tameh, we're going to see a distinction between two categories of Tumah. We're going to have Tumas Mes, and we'll have Tumas Sheretz. And offhand, I think you'll have to agree with me that Tumas Mes is much more chomer than Tumas Sheretz. I mean, Tameh Mes is an avatuma, and he requires hazah b'shlishi v'shvi, and he requires at least a minimum of 7 days. Tommy Sheretz, if somebody had contact with a Sheretz, he can go to the mikveh immediately afterwards and wait till Hariv Shemesh and he's tar. He doesn't have to wait 7 days. He certainly doesn't need hazah for mechatas from the paraduma. And yet in the sugi that we're about to embark upon, we're going to see something very strange. That in terms of a Kohen, if you're going to compare a Kohen who's tummy in one of these two categories, and Dafka, the category of a Sheretz, might be more severe than that of a Tomei Mes. And this is all based on what we call Ziknei Doron. Now, we're not sure exactly. The Talmud doesn't tell us who these Ziknei Doron were, and the historians have a whole to-do about this, were they Tanoim? And we're going to soon see that the Amoraim, like Rabbi like Reish Lakish, are going to reject the very ruling of the Chachmei, the Ziknei Doron. And if Ziknei Doron are Tanoim, it's very strange that Reish Lakish, as an Amora, could argue against them. But in any event, whoever they are, apparently they were scholars to the extent in which we're going to argue against them, we're going to try to defend them. And they said the following. Okay. When does the Mishnah disqualify the avoda of an orel? I'm sorry, we finished with orel, of a tomei. Lo shanu ela tmei sheretz. Aval tmei mes, etc. Before we see the logic of the Ziknei Doron, let's just understand what they're saying. They're saying that, you know what? Paradoxically, if the Kohen contracted tumah by contact with a sheretz, he's in worse shape than a Kohen who became contaminated by contact with a corpse, a dead corpse. And therefore, Voltami Mes, according to the Chachmei Tziknei Doron, if the Kohen contracted Tumas Mes, he might indeed be kosher for the avoda. Now again, when we say he's kosher for the avoda, I don't think that means l'chatchila we're going to choose this Kohen who's Tomei Mes, who has to wait 7 days, and Hazas Mechatas, and so forth and so on, until he becomes Torah. I don't think we're going to choose him as the Kohen HaOved. But for the Eved, according to the Ziknei Doron, the avoda of the Kohen who is Tomei Mes is kosher. Now, from this point in the sugya on, we're going to differentiate between two types of karbanos that are being brought by this Kohen. There's a karban tzibur and a karban yochid. Aval Tomei Mes mitoch shemeratze b'tzibur meratze nami b'yochid. What are we talking about now? We're talking about tzitz. You remember that the Kohen Gadol wore on his forehead a tzitz. Some sort of piece of gold, flattened out gold. On it said Lashem. And the tzitz is maratze on tumah. But here we have to differentiate between a karban tzibur and a karban yochid. In the case of a karban tzibur, the ritzi of the tzitz is even lechatchila. We can even invite a kohen tameh, let's say he's a tameh mes, to do the avoda of a karban tzibur. In the case of a karban yochid, we're only saying that this kohen, who contracted tumas mes, b'di'evet, his avoda qualifies and it's reliable. We're not going to go as far as to say that in a carbon yachid, we can appoint a Kohen who is tamei mes to do the avoda. But in any event, the bottom line is that according to Ziknei Daram, we have more of a chumrah in the case of a Kohen tamei sheretz than in the case of tamei mes. If the Kohen is tamei mes, then let's talk about a carbon yachid, then at least b'di'evet his avoda's kshera. Whereas in the case of a tamei sheretz, that's it. His avodah is completely disqualified. So Gemara says, it doesn't make any sense. I hachi tmei sheretz nami. Just want to see, did I skip something? No. Why do you tell me that a tamei sheretz, meaning a Kohen that contracted tumah because of his contact with the sheretz, his avodah is completely excluded? If you can tell me that in the case of Tmei Mes, according to the Ziknei Darom, the Kohen's avoda, despite the fact that he contracted Tumas Mes, is kosher, then for sure, with a Kal V'chomer, we have to say even more so in the case of a Kohen who contracted Tumah with a sheretz. Why? Because if we want to determine which Tumah is more chomer, then Ma Tmei Mes Sheton Azov B'Shlishi Maratza. If you're going to tell me that in the case, let's say, of a carbon tzibur, with even lechatchila, the tamei mes could do the avoda and is reaching through the tzitz. Hey, we're talking about a tumah chamura, a very severe tumah. The only way you can get out of that tumah of tumas mes is through hazah from the meichatos of the paraduma on shlishi and shvi. But tamei sheretz, eidotah and hazah, Gimel Shvi, but Tumas Sheretz is that much more lenient, and it does not require Azov Mei Paraduma. It's Eno Din Shemaratz. And certainly, if he did the Avoda, let's say, for example, in a carbon tzibur, we could let him do the Avoda L'chatchila like we do by a Tamei Mes, and in a carbon Yachid, at least b'di'evet, it would be kosher. And the Gemara answers that Kasavri to Chachmei Ziknei Dorom, that Mechaprim Kimiskaprim. Okay, let's see if we can figure this out. The Chachmei Dorom came up with an equation in the laws of Tumah and Karbonos between the carbon itself being, not the carbon itself, between the bilim of the carbon and the Kohen ha'oved. The bilim of the carbon are called the miskaprim, and the Kohen ha'oved is called the mechaper. Ma miskaprim tmei mes in, tmei sheretz lo, af mechaprim tmei mes in, tmei sheretz lo. Okay. We have a principle called Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur. But that principle applies only to a Tamei Mes. So Ruvain contracted Tumas Mes, and he could bring a carbon because of the Ritzui Tzitz. Shimon contracted Tumas Sheretz, and we cannot bring his carbon. We'll have to wait until he goes through whatever Tara. Now, When it says here that Tommy Mess in, I think it's referring to a carbon sibur. But in any event, we could use a carbon sibur to prove that paradoxically, the Torah was more maker with a tummy mess than with a tummy sheretz. Because in the case of a tummy mess, if let's say most of the tzibur are tmei mess, then we can bring the carbon betuma. That's called tuma hutra b'tzibur. That would not apply if most of the tzibur are tmeim sheretz. Now, while it might be true that the Ziknei Dharm could convince us that there's a kula and a leniency that applies to Tamei Mes in the case of the Miskaper, where where if we compare it to a Tamei Sheretz, we'd have to be Machmir. But how far are you willing to go? When I say you, I mean the Ziknei Dharm. Are you willing to allow a tummy mess to bring a carbon yachid? My kasavri. Let's analyze the shita of the Ziknei Dharm. So again, we're going to focus now on a tummy sheretz. And a tummy sheretz wants to bring his carbon. Let's say, for example, it's the 14th of Nisan. He wants to bring a Korban Pesach, but he's Tamei Sheretz. He can't go into the Mikdash. Do we have the right and the obligation to bring the carbon on his behalf? He'll appoint someone to bring the carbon. He can't go into the Mikdash, he's Tamei. But the carbon is brought on his behalf so that tonight, on the night of Pesach, he can eat the basar of the Korban Pesach. Ika savri, if we can assume that the Ziknei Dharm hold that Shochtim v'Zarkin al Tmei Sheretz, what does it mean? This individual, called Ruvain, contracted tumah through a sheretz. He can't come into the Mikdash, but he'll appoint someone who'll bring the carbon on his behalf. And we'll do the shechita on his behalf. We'll do the zrikas adam on his behalf. And then by nighttime, he's tahar, because that's all the Tmei Sheretz has to do. Wait until nightfall. And he'll eat the basar. Is therefore Milo Avdi Tzibur Betuma. If let's say the rove of the Tzibur are Tmei Sheretz, why can't we bring the carbon and apply the principle of Tuma Hutra B'Tzibur? Hakol Shebiyachid Nidche Tzibur Avdi Betuma. Okay, I'm sorry. I omitted one word. I would like to write a hora here to the editor. He they break it into many pages. So the word aim was left on the previous page. They should have put it on the top. Ein shochtin v'zarkin al tmei sheretz, which means that if Ruvain contracted to Masheretz, and he wants somebody else to bring his korban on his behalf on the 14th of Nisan, his korban Pesach, such that nighttime he's tired, he can eat from the basar Pesach. Ein shoftu. We're not going to do it. We will not bring a korban on his behalf. Right now, on the 14th, he is tameh. And if he's tameh, he's excluded from the korban. Let him bring a korban a month down the line on the 14th of Iyar, Pesach Sheni. Now, we have a rule that anybody as an individual who's pushed off to Pesach Sheni, if it's the tzibur in the same situation, we will bring the korban Pesach b'tzibur, b'tumah, and we'll apply the principle of tumah hutra b'tzibur. Hakol shebiyachid nidchet tzibur avdi b'tumah. And yet, the Ziknei Durham insists that if we're dealing with Tumah Sheretz, then there's no dispensation. Ella, but rather we must be saying that Kasavri Shoktiv Zorchan al Tumei Sheretz. That even if somebody is Tumei Sheretz, we can still bring the korban on his behalf. On the 14th, he'll eat the bus on the night of the 15th. Now we're not going to push him off to Pesach Sheni. And therefore, Chachmei Durham insists that if most of the tzibur are tamei tmei sheretz, then we will not bring the korban b'tumah, because the individual's tamei b'sheretz can fulfill his mitzvah b'shait. He's not pushed off to Pesach Sheni. So right now we're okay with the Chachmei Durham. However, the Gemara now rejects it. Omar Ula, Taka Lahu Reish Lakish Dromoy. Dromoy are these southerners. In other words, the Chachmei Ziknei Durham. And Taka, means he really rammed it into them. V'chi Ezo Koch Meruba. Let's just analyze this logically. Koch, excuse me, I'll just close the door here for a minute. Koch mechaprim or koch miskaprim? Right, which, shall we say, which power is greater? Should we focus our attention first and foremost on the Kohanim? Those are the mechaprim. Or on the owners of the korban, the Baliak korban, who are the miskapim. Heavy omer koch miskapim. You're going to have to come to the conclusion that the greater power is in the bailam of the korban. Because if you're going to tell me that if the bailam of the korban Pesach is Tomei Tumet Sheretz, and he can send his korban to the Beis Hamikdash through a shliach, who will bring the korban on his behalf. But you're telling me now that a Kohen who's Tomei Sheretz, if he himself does the avoda, according to the Ziknei Durham, the korban is possible. So it comes out that according to the Chachmei Durham, which is more chamur, which is more powerful, it's the bailim, because the bailim, even though they're Tomei Tumet Sheretz, they can bring the korban again through a shliach. But a Kohen who's Tomei Tumet Sheretz cannot do the avodah, and if he does, the avodah is psula. So Reish Lakish now rejects this. Argues against this. Ma b'makom shenitmu bailim b'sheretz mishalchin korban oseyem. If the balak korban contracted to Masheretz, he can still fulfill his obligation of korban pesach by sending the shliach. A shliach is kohen shenitma b'sheretz eino maratze, and nevertheless, you're telling me that the kohen can't achieve a qualified carbon, if he's tamei b'tumah sheretz, is then mokom shenitmu bailim b'mes she'ein mishalchin kavanoseihem. In the case of a mess, we don't accept a shliach. We're going to send him off packing to Pesach Sheni. Is then kohen shenitma b'mes einu din she'einu maratze. How can you possibly tell me, yes, Reish Lakish, that if the Kohen is Tamei B'tumas Mes, he can achieve a Ritzi Carbon? If we can't accept the carbon of a Tamei Mes, even if he were to appoint a Shliach to bring the carbon, and we're going to push him off to Pesach Sheni, then how much more so the Kohen himself, if he contracted Tumas Mes, he should not be capable of generating a Ritzui carbon. Hence, we don't understand how the Ziknei Durham could get away with it and say that, the Kohen is Tommy Tumas Mes, he can do the Avoda, even B'diah. And the Gemara says, Kasavri Ziknei Durham, to make sense of Ziknei Durham, Tommy Nesnavim Shalek Korbanosov, he rejects this whole premise of Reish Lakish, I should say, that a Tamei Mes is excluded from sending a carbon through a shliach, and he's automatically pushed off to Pesach Sheni. That's not true. If the owner of the Pesach is Tamei Mes, he can send a shliach to bring it. So what is Pesach Sheni then? And I guess Pesach Sheni, just one second. Instead of accepting the ferment Pesach Sheni, one is Tommy from Tumas Mes can send his carbon on the 14th of Nisan. The Kohanim would bring it as something, and that's acceptable. Although the owner is unable to partake of his offering due to the state of Tumas Mes, which extends even beyond that, so that nevertheless he discharged the obligation. Eating the carbon is not. So I don't know. I'm tempted to think that we're talking about a Bailam who didn't take advantage of the opportunity, or maybe we're talking about a Richuk Makom. Anyway, so the Gemara asks right away, Vaksiv, Ish ki yeh tamei v'asa Pesach v'chodesh hasheni. If a man was Tomei Tumas Mes, he has to bring a carbon Pesach Sheni, which is what we assumed all along. And now you're telling me no, that according to the Chachmei Dorom, he could avail himself of Pesach Rishon by sending a Shliach. And where it says Lemitzvah. The Pasuk wants to teach us that someone who's Tomei Mes should wait until Pesach Sheni, and then by that time he'll be Tar. But if he would go ahead and send the Pesach through a Shliach while he was Tomei, he definitely has fulfilled his obligation. But Lemitzvah, if he wants to do it the right way, so that he can eat the basar, then he should wait until Pesach Sheni. For the Gemara v'aksiv ish lefi achlo. So the Pesach has to be shechted on behalf of someone who is capable of eating the basar. A tamei, even though he's tamei mes, he's not capable of eating the basar. Anywhere it says lemitzvah, that when the Torah says lefi achlo, that is the full fulfillment, the perfect fulfillment of the mitzvah, that the one who brings the carbon, the bailam, should be able to eat the basar. But even if he's tamei and he can't eat the basar, nevertheless, it's acceptable and valid, and the carbon pesach is kosher. And we'll have to stop here. But the next question in the Gemara is also part of the same sugi that we're learning, like kuvei lo. You're saying no. Even if he can't eat the carbon pesach, there's a kiyum of havas korban and kiyum korban even without achila. That's not true with regard to the korban pesach. The whole purpose of a korban pesach, as we'll see in Mitzvah Shem in the next daf, is in order to eat the basar, and therefore Tomei Mes should be pushed off under all circumstances if he can't eat the basar to Pesach Sheni. Okay, then, so we'll stop here, and I'll wish you a Chag Sameach, and hopefully we get together during Chol Hamoed. Well, you'll let me know if that works.